So hi, my name is Hjorr Hakonarson. I live here in Tremere. Looks like we got a lot of folks, faces I don't quite recognize. So welcome visitors. Unfortunately, this was originally intended to be so much more of an active thing, and obviously most cooking displays end up having something that you could eat. So I had to get a little creative with it to do it virtually, and unfortunately the setup that I had it outside, I had to move and take pictures of because we're about to get our afternoon in Tremere thunderstorm. So please bear with me. Feel free to ask any questions you might have. I apologize if there isn't anything to eat, but I think that we can at least kind of give a good overview of the things that I wanted to talk about. There we go. So to start off with a couple of terms and references. I like to throw these out for people who, for those of you who have been around the SCA for a very long time, probably remember the speaking fortuitously, which tended to be sort of a pidgin Shakespearean English. That's kind of fallen by the side. But obviously that's perfectly period for somebody who's a 16th century English, but not necessarily for anybody else. So I actually like to throw in little phrases and words here and there just to kind of season the persona, so to speak. So a couple that are useful here. First off, the Norse people tended to eat 2 meals a day, a dog meal and a nacht meal, respectively about 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So that's day meal and evening meal. And these meals would generally be eaten around the Meadhall, or the meal fire, in the central portion of a hall. For smaller steads, they might have a separate outbuilding or kitchen known as the Eldhus, which means firehouse. A couple of little cultural things about that. The Norse economic system, similar to the Saxon economic system of the Dark Ages, was based on manorialism, which meant that way away from the cities, you tended to have collections of large landowners, and they would have generally a very large central Meadhall or a Meadhall. That was the general active life of the community. In the case of the Saxon communities, it was generally based on geography and the local people. In the case of the Norse, it tended to be based more on kinship and extended cousins and so on and so forth. So the farms themselves might actually be farther distributed than they may be in the Saxon times, because it was based on those familiar relationships. So anyway, the lord or king generally did not actually have a residence in the hall, permanent residence in the hall. They would have their own separate area to sleep, but usually their huskarla, or household servants, generally would sleep in the hall on the raised platforms on either side that are known as flats, which is actually the Norse word for floor. And then the local community would have a number of other smaller outbuildings that were purpose-built for economic purposes, like barns and nousts or shipyards, or for smaller buildings for servants or the carlar, or middle-class tradespersons that would live in the area. And then that would be distinctly different from the cities where a lot of the trade would occur, but those buildings tended to be much more smaller, closer together. Even though the settlements themselves may not have been numbered more than 1,000, they looked an awful lot like any modern downtown. So for those of you who are Tolkien nerds might recognize the word Meadhall. That is actually the Saxon word for Meadhall. And you'll notice that there is a lot of commonality between the Saxon, German, and Norse Meadhall culture. In fact, the Roman author Tacitus wrote quite a bit about it in the 1st century, where, while there wasn't any really the notion of a king or a jarl or even a large landowner at that point, there were much more independent warbands. The basics of the culture itself survived from pretty much the 3rd or 4th century BC until the 11th and 12th century, more or less unaltered. And even then, to a certain extent, it just morphed into the feudal system that we're all generally familiar with. One of the more important people in the lord's household would be the shop, or the skald, the performer, poet, harp player. harp is actually the Saxon and Norse word for the six-string instrument we generally refer to as a lyre from its Greek name. I actually have one that I've played, and many in Tremaris have probably seen that, and I would have had that as part of my thing, but unfortunately my camera is broken, so it's a little harder to do that portion of the show today. I apologize. But anyway, so that skald or shop would be the person who would compose lay poems extolling the virtues of the king, encomiastic for people who had passed on, the warriors that had passed on, as well as kind of serving as the conscience / recorder of the local culture. The word skald actually comes from a Norse word meaning to throw away. There's a whole other set of lessons that I've done on lyres and performance of poems and whatnot, but suffice to say, it's not quite what we think of as performances today. Generally, either the music or the poems were done independently as opposed to singing along songs. But like I said, it was a very honored portion of the king's retinue. The other two positions I wanted to point out was the Curathane and the Durathane, or the Cupserver Dorser. The words are actually the same in Saxon and Norse. You see a little bit of this again, from the Lord of the Rings, when Eowyn brings the cup of wine to Aragorn in the Meadhall after the Battle of Helm's Deep. And it's a concept that is recurringly seen in Beowulf, when the king's wife greets Beowulf as he comes into Hryggr, as well as a number of sagas. So having the lady of the household, and lady actually comes from the Saxon word lofli, which means loaf giver, or loaf bearer, I should say. And they would meet each of the warriors with a cup of mead or ale, and that was sort of the official welcome to the club sort of thing. The other person, of course, the Durathane or the door guard was obviously important because you didn't want to get attacked in the middle of your meal. And hall burnings are a central theme in a number of Norse sagas, in particular the Njal saga, which is one of the longest and the greatest and well-known sagas. So that person had to be a particularly keen eye to make sure that no imposters were coming in, and keep an eye on the watch that nobody was sneaking up. It is notable that that person is the first person who tended to get killed in the Beowulf as Hrothgar and his thanes were stalked by the Grendel. The next one is Invegsuler, or high seat pillars. This is specifically a Norwegian and Icelandic term, at least that's where we have most of the documentation about it. But this is speaking about the king's dais or the lord's dais, and that chair would be offset by these high seat pillars that indicated it as a place of special status. In particular, some of the early foundings of Iceland, you'll read about Auda Deepminded, who was the daughter of Kettle Flatnose, a thane of the Shetlands, one of the first settlers, ridiculously brilliant woman, hence her name, and a woman of very significant power in and of her own right. And she founded, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but one of the major settlements in early Iceland by throwing her high seat pillars over the side of the boat as she was coming into the island, and then they would say that they would build their hall wherever they came ashore. Our next couple of words is the first is Hjorr, or beer fellowship, is sort of an informal party. I have not been able to find a Norse equivalent to that. That is actually a Saxon word. It is also notable to point out just how important beer was to the Saxon and Norse culture. This is not just simply because they like drinking, but in that time, the way of making beer required fairly pure water to not go immediately skunky, because there was no preservatives in any of the beer, and you would immediately know if the water that you were making your beer out of went bad. So you always had beer on hand, freshly brewed, to make sure that you knew that your water supply was good. And in fact, there's another term from Beowulf, Meadhall, my personal favorite word in Saxon, which basically translates as our society is completely and utterly screwed, it literally translates as we're out of beer. If you remember the story, or you remember the Angelina Jolie animated version, the first thing that Grendel does when he kicks to the door is knock over the beer. And that the whole point there is the idea that, okay, it just got real. You know, you guys are doomed. I'm gonna do this very specific thing to make sure that you understand that. Our next one is the symbol, which is the Norse word, and this is the high feast. And these tended to be where you're going to see the really expensive foods, the really expensive linens, the things that don't normally happen are going to happen here. For those of you, again, Tolkien teens, if you remember the white flower that was placed on the grave of Theodred, which means the memories of the high feast. And it's a Tolkien drawing from his rich heritage of Saxon Norse studies to talk, basically reinforce that this is the time when the Lord is really putting on the show, is this symbol. So everything has got to be just so that society is doing very well. And that's kind of the other imagery of Beowulf, is that the hall is the most protected, the most sanctified portion of the Germanic warband culture. This is where the Lord breaks the rings and shares the wealth and provides the food for his warriors, and his warriors are there to vouchsafe the lands and the kingdom and to stand before their Lord. And that hearth in the center with the fire and the warmth and the camaraderie that come out of it, that is all kind of encapsulated in this concept of the symbol. So the Symbol, or a memory of the high feast, is to sort of show that even after death, we remember those good times. The last thing I wanted to throw out was the thing that's generally just interpreted in English as a flighting, although the Norse word for it is fena. You could kind of call it a rap battle. There's a very famous one, obviously, in Beowulf. The flighting is Unferth, who is the king's cousin, who tried to call out Beowulf, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, well I was totally late because I had to kill a sea serpent on the way there, and why are you calling me out?" Yeah, of course I didn't win the swim contest around the island 5 times. The other one that's actually quite famous is from the poetic Edda, and that is called the Lokasena, and this is basically Loki pretty much slamming hard all of the other gods of Asgard. Probably make a great sequel to Thor if they ever wanted to shoot it as a movie. So I highly recommend that one. It's actually kind of funny, but it's a very stylized type of poetry. The reason that I thought of this one actually is, ironically, with the rise of Hamilton on Disney Plus. I had seen somebody do an analysis. I personally have not seen it yet, but I had seen somebody do an analysis of the lyrics of some of the songs. I was like, that was really kind of interesting, because it actually, that internal rhyming scheme and the use of consonants and the way the meters are not strict iambs or trochees as in with Latin and French poetry, but are rolling meters, is much more like Germanic poetry than it is most Latin poetry. And to a very high degree of art. I was actually quite impressed. But the point there is that those hall stendas would feel very much like the rap battles in Hamilton, are for English, only just done in Norse. By the same token, the old heroic meter of the Latin and Greeks, of Ovid and Homer, is the dactylic hexameter, sounds an awful like sea shanties, or actually if you demonstrably say the lyrics to Rainbow Connection, that's exactly what the Iliad would sound like if you heard it in the original Greek being taught, because of the way that the poetic meter and the use of the rhyme actually work in the language. So, for sources, obviously we don't have a lot of material sources other than detritus from old burial mounds and midden heaps and halls, pottery shards. things like that. But the Bayeux tapestry actually does provide kind of a one-size-fits-all for a number of things that we can use to reconstruct the material culture of feasting in the modern times. So all the way on the far left, you'll see a brazier. Kind of a common Viking reenactorism is those triangular raised kitchens, which are really about the fact that there's too many places in America where you're not allowed to have ground fires. So those are sort of a reenactorism. But square braziers like that have actually been known from Roman times. So that is entirely period. You'll see the little tray there of food, as well as the meat hook with what looks like a sausage or some kind of meat. It is notable, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but roasting of beef is absolutely the highest status thing. Nobody did that unless you were ridiculously rich. And we'll get into a little bit more why later. But just to keep in mind that steak night really meant you were bringing out the big guns and dressing to the nines. There, the second panel there, you'll see some high seat pillars or renditions thereof. And then after that is the table with shields. Those of you who have been in the Tremere camp at Gulf Wars will perhaps have seen the shields. In particular, that trussel there, the trussels are described in a number of sagas and they're described in Beowulf, but nobody has any physical evidence of what they look like. In fact, there's only really one table that we have any physical evidence for. It's the Lund table, and I call it the Lund coffee table because it's only about 14 inches high. And it really is just a slab with 4 round legs pegged into it. So that is the only table physical evidence of the material culture we have. But this the set of trussels there has become very common for setting of tables. In fact, I have one as well that I'll show you in a little bit. The next one there is the round table or rounder table. A lot of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle have some rounder tables. What we don't really know is if they were just trying to show a very long table and keep it into a narrow frame, or if they actually had round tables as a thing, again, because we just don't have any evidence. I would generally suppose that it was really a very long beer hall type table that they were just trying to keep in frame simply because of the size and the shape of the halls doesn't really lend itself efficiently to using round tables. So anyway, lots of little things in the Bayeux tapestry that are useful for pulling out food culture, to include over here where you see different types of plates and eating utensils and the spits with the birds of some type on the spits, somebody blowing the horn, somebody drinking from the mead horn, somebody drinking from a table or from a chalice. Lots of really good little pieces on here to use as evidence. And here's an example from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. A couple of things on here. You see the third figure on the right there was using a sax. It's kind of a common reenactorism to carry around saxes that are practically swords, or at least short swords. I know I have one, and they're certainly not unknown. And even our single-ended or single-edged swords of some renown, not unknown. But it's infinitely more common for somebody to carry a much smaller knife, from 3 to 6 inches blade length, and that was the scrimasax, which actually is the eating knife. So you'll see there what looks like some fruit or cheese being cut off, some other serving bowls, what looks to be sausages or meat on a spit that's being carved off, not entirely like going to Texas de Brazil. You'll also see the white tablecloth there with what looks to be trim bands on it. It's kind of important to point out that white was very hard to do in period. Pretty much your only option was to boil down urine, soak it in that, lay it out in the sun, and let the sun bleach it, and then of course clean it out. So that was terribly, terribly expensive. So if you're going to bring out the big linens, they're going to be white. And also the ability to actually press the linens and get those linen folds and linen pleats. It was sort of another high status symbol, which is why you see the use of pleats, which basically says not only do I have the time to map this out, but I have the money to afford extra cloth that I don't actually need. that is kind of a big time status symbol. A couple of literary sources. We've talked at length about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We talked a little bit about Beowulf. We talked about the Eddaic poems. There's elements in a number of the Norse sagas, but that goes along with the usual caveat that those were generally written in the 13th and 14th century. So sometimes you have to be a little careful with those minor living details. They may be much more representative of 13th and 14th century life rather than the 10th, 9th, 10th, and 11th century historical events that they are recounting. Although, at least for a number of those sagas, we have correlating evidence that the historical events that they're speaking of are probably pretty accurate. It also seems that a lot, while obviously there was a shift in certain things as the Norse societies shifted from paganism to Christianity, a lot of the basics stayed relatively straightforward or relatively similar through almost the 16th and 17th centuries. So a lot of the little isms, as long as you can peel away the religious significance, tend to be probably pretty accurate to the time. For those of you who are a little older, I remember when I was growing up in the 1970s, it seemed like there was still a lot of American isms that dated back at least to World War II, some to World War I in the late 19th century that were still around. It seems like a lot of that stuff has been completely swept away in the intervening 30 or 40 years, but to a degree that it did not seem like, at least to me, that it was as true for the earlier parts of America. I mean, we still had army surplus stuff in the 70s and 80s that was left over from World War II, as an example. A couple of sources. Viking Answer Lady, for those of you who are not familiar with her, she's a great source for a lot of things. She has a great food page to include a number of recipes. There's a Amazon book in there. It's a little on the pricey side. I picked it up when I was in Denmark. It typically runs between 50 and 80 bucks, depending on where you get it from. But it is a fantastic source. And what it does is it kind of lays out a culinary journey of a number of the major trading cities from the Viking world with representative recipes. And like everything else, to say Viking, covers 300 years in 6 countries. So there were a lot of regional differences. Typically people in Iceland, in the Faroes, the Hebrides, and so on and so forth, tended to eat almost exclusively fish or seabirds, eggs, things like that, things that you would find where there weren't a lot of trees. There wasn't really a lot of arable farming land, but you were right on the water. Norway in particular has a very fish-based diet. In fact, if you've ever been there or ever seen pictures of it, you realize that most of the country is fragmented little villages, it still is, that are separated by large mountains that are actually more passable by water than they are by land. And the land is generally sheltered by a series of large outcroppings or islands that is known as the leads. These were great for German submarines to hide in World War II, by the way. But they're also fairly protective of the weather for the inland area. So most of the fishing would occur along these waterways. And there was a particularly adept Viking named Harald Meadhall, who had swore that he would never comb or cut his beard until he brought all of Norway under his sway. And he happened to be a large landowner in a place called Vestvik, which was the breakover between the north and the south part of Norway. And he collected fees from everybody passing through on their way to go fishing. And with this massive amount of money, he raised the army that actually enabled him to become the first king of a unified Norway. The last one there is another book by Stephen Pullington called Meadhall, Feast and Tradition, Anglo-Saxon England. Obviously, again, there's a lot of commonalities between the two. I think this one's a pretty excellent resource. It talks a lot about all the things that we've touched on here today. So, sources from the Augsburg find. For the material pieces of day-to-day cooking, this is definitely the mother lode of primary artifacts. So to the left there, you'll see an iron cauldron. Iron cauldrons actually became a thing during the 9th century. Before that, you did a lot of light use crockery, although that was still used afterwards, as well as soapstone, carved soapstone for making smaller dishes. But it's very hard to make a large pot that way. You'll also see a frying pan there. I actually have another one that I've made a replica of that I'll show you, as well as a couple of serving dishes, trenchers, and bowls. And then on the right, you also have some more trenchers, knives, ladles, buckets, and so on and so forth. So if you're looking for primary research, this is the place to go. Excuse me. Is the Osberg find? It's in Oslo. And if you get a chance to go, I highly recommend it. I was there a couple years or 2 years ago. All right, food preparation basics. We talked a little bit about fish and seabirds. Fish tended to be not oily fish for the most part, although they did eat salmon, but that was tended to be eaten on the day of. A lot of cod and herring was either pickled or salted or smoked or dried for preservation. Eggs and dairy. My point about beef was that there was a lot of dairy in the Viking diet. The reason is that, among others, that the word "yeah," which means cattle, also means money, also means wealth. So the number of cows you had was very much an indicator of how rich you were. You didn't generally want to eat them because you're literally eating your own money. You would do so after the dairy cows went dry, but that's why most of the meat would tend to be pickled away and then boiled because it tended to be very tough because it was from an old cow that had dried up. But if you were doing beef on a spit, not only are you losing all those juices and wasting all that stuff, and you were showing that you had money to spare. So that's why I said if you see beef on a spit, that's the show. That's the big feast. Vegetables and starches. Obviously, they didn't have potatoes, but they did have turnips, and you can do an awful lot with turnips that taste just as good. I've done a couple of meals now with boiled turnips. Boil them with either field peas, which is a legume, or boil them with bacon or ham stock or ham bones, or also there's another recipe in that book boiled turnips with hazelnut butter, which is really quite yummy, or pickled turnips. The pickling, of course, is very similar to the pickling of today. It's basically rotted milk and brine. And there's a good recipe for how to make the pickling juices in there as well. Other vegetables, fennel. Onions are actually not known until very late in the Viking Age, but they did use a lot of garlic and a lot of leeks. Onions supposedly came from Persia, so they would have been an import from Varangians or from people traveling in the Mediterranean, which wasn't pretty much until the 11th century. Again, field peas were common. So the green peas that we know today aren't exactly right, but black-eyed beans, black-eyed Susans, those are all actually very similar. You can occasionally get field peas. That is actually an actual similar species. Kale as cabbage, that's actually the Norse word for cabbage is kale. So we can thank them for kale. So there's a whole other list of vegetables and starches in that book. Herbs and spices, there are some. Ginger late in the period. Salt, of course, although salt was very expensive. Those of you who have ever been to the East have heard this is common for East Kingdom feasts is below the salt and above the salt, meaning you can bring your own food and sit in the feast hall with everyone else. I actually think that's a fantastic idea, but I've tried to bring it to Camaras a couple of times with limited success. But it also tended to mean for the warriors that had participated in the battle or getting a part of the booty, they would sit closer to the king and they wouldn't have enough salt to put salt cellars all the way down the table, so that if you were above the salt, that meant you were a special guest. If you're below the salt, you may not have done all the same things that everybody else had. Dill, thyme, things like that. But they generally didn't spice up their food. They would cook the food with ingredients that tended to impart other flavors on it, or use jams, or things like that. So nuts, lingonberry, blackberries, blueberries, angelica, which is a type of celery. It was also used a lot to flavor food. And if you do a little bit of mix and matching, it's amazing how what would otherwise be fairly bland things taken in isolation actually taste fantastic when you mix it all together. I did one with my favorite, kettle worms, which is leeks and minced pork and salt and thyme in sausages boiled together, and then with turnips and field peas and the hazelnut butter, and then some rye, boiled rye bread that are almost like dumplings with lingonberry in it. It's absolutely fantastic. And the lingonberry is great on the sausage. The lingonberry is great on the turnips and everything. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about the land mammal proteins, cattle, not so much. Pork absolutely was very common. Pork and chicken was probably the proteins of choice, because the pigs didn't generally do anything alive in the way that the other animals did. You used pig fat for lighting fires because it burns extraordinarily hot. You use it for a lot of military applications. Obviously, you can use it for greasing things with building boats. A lot of pig bones were used for a lot of little knickknacks around the place. So you would generally get your pigs and slaughter them at just 3 or 4 years old, and then sire new ones. So they were pretty much just used as garbage collection and food source. But so when I was kind of working on a persona contest, I was figuring out what does it actually take to build a cottage industry around building a Viking longships, and how many people do I need, and how much money is that worth, and how much food. So I figured for the 20 people that I needed at maximum to build a 20 bench Viking longship once a year and sustain my farm and its tax base and so on and so forth, I need to slaughter only 2 pigs to feed everybody. With chickens for the lean days. So one big pig actually goes a long way. Lamb, of course, was useful alive for wool. Vodmal, which is of course green wool, was the other equivalence for money. So this is another reason to keep your lambs alive. And lastly, horse. They certainly ate horses, although it was considered a fairly regal food, because obviously horses are also used as draft animals and for riding. And in particular, the eating of horse meat seemed to be one of the more contentious things about going from paganism to adopting Christianity. And in Iceland, that was actually one of the 2 things that was okay, we'll vote in your new religion, but you got to let us keep eating the horse meat. And that was actually decided by the parliament in 999. And it occurs in a lot of the sagas that you read that, hey, why are you eating horse meat? Clearly, you're not Christian yet. So it's sort of a dead giveaway that they hadn't quite gotten rid of the old gods yet. Preparation, drying is obviously a very common one. In general, when you don't live in Florida, if you cook even bird, which tends to be a very light protein that goes bad very easily, and dry it out, it will actually keep pretty well. It's almost like bird jerky, but it'll actually keep very well. In fact, that's why the peacock is the symbol of eternal life, is because if you cook that and just cook it, it will not actually rot. It may dry out, but it won't actually rot. It'll keep around forever. Salting is obviously, and you really want to pickle it in brine. I've done quite a bit with some pickling in brine. I started that with turkeys for Thanksgiving, and I've experimented a little bit with pork and beef and a couple of other things. And that doesn't actually roast very well. It tends to be very salty, but it boils up real nice. And that's the point, is that boiling tended to be the most common way for preparing food for a number of reasons. One, you can get all that salt in the way and acid out of it that's used, and smoke that's used to prepare it. And 2, it's one pot, so there isn't a lot of cleaning. And 3, you kind of boil the meat first, and now you have a really nice stock to work with. As you put those other things in there, they end up adopting a lot of the flavor, and that really actually makes the meal, at least in my opinion. That's why I said, again, the thing about the roasting. The roasting, that's kind of a special deal. We talked a little bit about the iron cauldrons and soapstone pottery already. pickling in brine and in whey. You can make the whey that we do now, either by straining milk or by letting it go sour, or through skyr, which is a type. Well, technically it's a cheese, but it tastes like yogurt, which is a common Icelandic dish. It's carried at Publix now, so I've been stocking up. And last is lye or ash, which is common for fish, although those of you who have heard of lutefisk, that's not actually a period Viking dish. It's sort of a, what do we do with all this lye ash? Oh, well, we can boil it. Oh, look, it turns into jello. Oh, let's slather it in butter and fry it. Call it a dish. But they did actually use lye and ash as a preparation during the Viking Age. We talked about roasting breads. Breads in the period did not rise. They did not use yeast. So they would use either rye. Wheat is not entirely unknown, but it's not especially common. And pea flour. You can still get pea flour. It's one of those things where it doesn't actually have a great deal of nutritional value. And there's some medical stuff that says that it may not be the best thing for you. So you might want to take that with with some caution. But I've used a lot of rye. Like I said, you just mix some rye flour with just enough water to make it stick together. Ball it up, throw it into cheese pot, throw it in the stock pot. Actually makes a pretty nice bread, but it's practically a dumpling. And then, of course, obviously a lot of flattened bread. The other notable thing is they didn't actually use any egg or milk as a protein binding like we tend to do in modern cooking. They tended to just use the proteins in the grains themselves, like oats and stuff like that. So if you're gluten sensitive, you probably aren't going to be eating any Viking bread. But that is it is interesting that it actually works. Just some wet oat cakes, and they'll actually stick together. A couple of historical sites to visit on here. I haven't been to Lofoten yet myself. It's on my bucket list. The nice thing about Lofoten is they actually have a feast using period Viking ingredients and meals there as one of the things you can do as a guest. It's it's like 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It's pretty far up there in Norway, but it's on my list of things to do. The second one is literally just opened about 2 months ago. It was christened by Queen Margrethe II, the Queen of Denmark, and that is in Lera, which is on the main island of Zealand, which is where Copenhagen is. It is now the second largest Viking Hall replica. They've been working on that for quite some time. The third one there is one of the halls at Fyrkat. Sadly, that one you can't eat at. But the Fyrkat is one of the Viking cruciform castles or fortifications that was built by Harald Bluetooth in the northern part of Norway. I was there about 2 years ago. And then down at the bottom is Hedeby. This is a great place to go. Awarding, it's pretty far off the beaten path for most tourists. So A, it's not easy to get to, and B, it's technically in Germany, even though it was an old Danish town. And three, because it's German on off the beaten path, virtually nothing there is in English. So either go with somebody who knows German, or be at least functional enough with your German that you can kind of figure out what it is you're looking at. Because none of the dig books are in English; they're only in German or Danish, and most of the displays are also in German. Because it's Western Germany, you can usually find somebody who speaks English, but it does actually add a little extra to it to try to figure it out. There's another site that's close that's called Riba. It was kind of like the Miami of the Viking era. They also do the Viking meals there as well. So it's on my bucket list to go back and hit Mosgard, Riba, and Hedeby again, because they're all within a couple hours drive of each other. All right, next was going to be my display. So I just have some pictures here. So first off, this is my cooler. This is actually a replica of the Augsburg 42, which is a six-board chest that was covered with iron bands and gilt nail heads. I have a styrofoam shell that I got from Charlie Steaks inside of that, but it actually works amazingly well in the cooler. So anyway, it's just a nice little thing to have in the camp. Here's one of my tables. This is one of those trestles. You can see there from the Bayeux tapestry. I've got another rowing bench that I had built there with a period locking mechanism and some forge cut nails that I made. That's what I usually keep all of my kitchen gear in. Ceramics were certainly known, ceramic pitchers, ceramic cups. You can see a couple of carved bone salt cellars there, salt and pepper cellars were certainly known. Forks, we don't think so. There's been no evidence that I've ever been able to find of a fork, although there are small knives, and I have a little small speck there that I use just to kind of poke at food as well as cut it. Spoons, however, are known, even though they are Middle Eastern imports. Bowls, plates turned out of wood or bone. You can see the horn cup that I had there to drink from. The last thing is that is a bit of a reenactorism. That's one of those Mary Rose lanterns, but it looks old enough that a lot of Viking reenactors will use them anyway. I certainly do. But the design is actually from the Mary Rose, which is several hundred years later. There are, however, a number of candelabras that look exactly like a 19th century candelabra that have been found in Viking graves. So you can, as long as it's not super ornate, a plain iron or plain brass probably works just fine. There's actually a little Viking longship one with 3 candles in the middle that I've been meaning to make as a little candelabra. So that's good for lighting. Cookware. So you'll see there's my replica frying pan up at the upper left. Basically just had to dish out a piece of 14 gauge steel and then take that metal piece of the back and split it in half, kind of splay it out as a thing to hold up the pan, and then just put it together with a rivet. You can see my little ladle there that I turned on my lathe and hand carved out. There's a cauldron I made. That is actually the back end of a propane tank, which was the easiest way to make it. I've been playing around with trying to hammer one out. That is actually a lot harder than it looks. You can buy a replica for about $300 or $400, which is why I was trying to see if I could make one. But it can be done. And then up at the right, there is a pipkin. So the ceramic dishes, just like they're used earlier or later, is actually a way. I usually cook my vegetables in that, or at least prep them out in that. And then here's a detail in the place setting. So I turned I turned that bowl, I turned that plate. I've got a pear and a kind of a smaller dish as well. You can see one of my hand forged spoons and that little ceramic sacks, salt cellars, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, decorations, which I misspelled. Obviously, the Bayeux tapestry is celebrating the defeat of Vikings, so that may not have been the theme of the tapestry, but it is certainly of the style that was used in the hall. And they're long and short, just like the Bayeux tapestry. It's like 200 some odd feet long and only about 2 feet high, and hand woven. And then one of my little banners there, that quarter moon is taken from brass wind vanes that have been found on a number of Viking longships. There's like 4 or 5 of them in extent. They using them as cloth banners as sort of a Viking reenactorism. I don't know if there's any physical evidence for it, but it seems to be keeping with the idea, and it looks cool. So I will have a couple on poles around my camp as well. And with that, are there any questions?
The one picture with the meat on the skewers or swords that you were saying is kind of like the Brazilian steakhouses now. Would they have used minced meat like they do in the Middle East? Where they kind of form the minced meat around the skewer? Like a sausage without a casing formed onto the skewer? Is there like record of that?
I don't know that there's any record of that, but they certainly did all the individual pieces. So that's the thing about the kettle worms is you actually want to mince the pork instead of grinding it for the right consistency. So I believe that's based on some references to mincing the meat. Mincing the meat on the hooks, I don't know if that's all been all put together, but that's an interesting question. I'm going to have to go look that up myself now.
Pretty regular. That looked pretty regular. It didn't look like, I mean, it could have been a sausage, but it certainly wasn't a normal cut of meat unless it was just artist, like artistic license or something.
Right. So, and there was actually Viking contacts in the Middle East as early as 820s. So it's and fairly consistent thereafter. So it's entirely reasonable that anything that was contemporary in the near Middle East would have made it that far. Especially when you're talking about a technique rather than a thing. You know, there's we found the Buddha at Birka, and yeah, there's lots of really interesting one-off things at Birka. There's probably not a lot of them. It's sort of unique in terms of things, but in terms of ways of doing things, the Vikings were definitely biggest simulators. So I would say that that's entirely reasonable that in that 150 years that might have been, hey, you know, this tastes pretty good, let's do it.
Thank you.
Okay.
That was awesome. Thank you, sir.
One more quick question. Can you list what King of Spices Norse would use? Or did you already answer that? Sorry.
Give me 2 seconds. I had to run and grab the book here, so I'm not doing this from memory. What do we got? So caraway, cloudberries, creeping thyme, dog roses, rose hips, ramsons, scallions, thyme, angelica. You can use apple, apple mint, barley, bilberry, blackberry, rapeseed oil, carrots, cherries, coriander, dill, ergot, although I would not recommend that in the modern era because it is actually hallucinogen and it can cause a spontaneous abortion if you're pregnant. But it was used as a spice apparently back then. Grapeseed, hazel, honey of course, hops, juniper. In fact, juniper was actually used as in lieu of hops for making beer. There's a modern variant of that called sati, which is still made in Finland and Estonia, and occasionally in places around America. Well, I have not been able to find a place that would ship it to Florida, and I've been looking now for about 2.5 years. Lingonberry, malt vinegar, mugwort, mustard, plums, salt, slow.
Oh, right. Oh, we're running a little bit over, and I think you're doing the next one in about 10 minutes, so I would probably give you a little break. Thank you for the lesson. I'm going to stop the recording.